There's an old truth that every empire eventually forgets. The moment you start speaking like a conqueror, you remind everyone else why they stopped trusting you in the first place. And once that trust breaks, it doesn't come back with an apology. It doesn't come back at all. History is full of leaders who mistook nostalgia for strength, who believed that invoking past glory would make them look powerful. But here's what they never understood. When you glorify conquest, you don't intimidate your neighbors. You unite them. You don't project strength. You expose fear. Because only someone worried about losing power tries to reclaim it by threatening to rewind history. And today, February 5th, 2026, the world is watching that lesson play out in real time. What began as a campaign speech in Texas has turned into the most serious diplomatic crisis North America has faced in the modern era. Because Donald Trump didn't just make a provocative remark. He didn't just push boundaries for applause. He crossed a line that most leaders stopped touching decades ago. He publicly glorified the U.S. invasion of Mexico in 1848 and hinted openly and unmistakably that history itself could be revisited. And within hours, that rhetoric triggered a response that has now placed the United States in an unprecedented position, not of strength, of isolation. Mexico didn't flinch. Mexico didn't scramble for diplomatic cover. Mexico didn't beg for clarification or wait for a walk back. Mexico responded with speed, precision, and something Trump clearly didn't expect: moral authority. And the response didn't just corner Trump politically, it reframed the entire conflict. No longer a bilateral dispute, now a global issue of sovereignty, of limits, of whether the rules that ended the age of empires still mean anything at all. To understand how explosive this moment really is, we have to go directly to Trump's words. Because words, especially from the most powerful office on earth, are never just words. They are signals, they are tests, and sometimes they are weapons. Less than 48 hours ago, speaking at the rally in El Paso, Texas, with the Mexican border literally visible behind him, Trump went off script. The prepared remarks were about immigration, about border security, about policies his base already supports. But then Trump did what Trump does. He improvised. He started reminiscing about the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848. And then he said the line that detonated everything. According to the official transcript, Trump told the crowd that people forget Texas, California, Arizona used to be ours. He paused. Then he corrected himself. He said it wasn't originally American territory. But then came the phrase that crossed every line. He said, "We took it." He called it one of the best takes ever. And then, with a smirk, the cameras caught perfectly. He added that maybe we'll have to make some of those deals again. Let that sink in. Trump didn't say purchased. He didn't say negotiated. He didn't say won through diplomacy. He used the language of seizure, of conquest, of force. And then he framed it, not as a historical regret, not as a complicated legacy, but as something worth celebrating, worth repeating. That wasn't a historical footnote. That was a signal. The crowd erupted. Cheers, chants, applause for Trump's base. It sounded like strength, like a leader unafraid to say what others won't, like a return to an America that didn't apologize, didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. But for Mexico, it sounded very different. It sounded like a direct threat, not metaphorical, not symbolic. A sitting U.S. president publicly suggesting that territorial conquest might return to the table. And for the rest of the world, it sounded like something far more dangerous. a crack in the foundation of the post-1945 order, a signal that the rules constraining great powers might be negotiable after all, that borders once settled might be unsettled again if someone powerful enough decides they should be. Why would Trump do this? Why take that risk? Why say something that anyone with basic diplomatic awareness would know would trigger an international incident? Analysts see two layers, and both of them are disturbing in different ways. First, domestic politics. This kind of rhetoric energizes Trump's most radical supporters by invoking a mythic version of American dominance, a version where power answers to no rules, where strength is measured not by alliances built, but by enemies humiliated, where history isn't studied, it's weaponized. For a certain segment of Trump's base, the 1848 war isn't a complex historical event with moral ambiguities. It's a trophy, a reminder of when America could take what it wanted without asking. And Trump knows that invoking that memory triggers something deep: pride, nostalgia, and a hunger for that feeling to return. But the second layer is far more unsettling because this wasn't just about applause lines. This looks increasingly like psychological pressure, a calculated move to reopen historical trauma to test how far Mexico can be pushed before it fractures. In other words, Trump wasn't just talking. He was probing, testing defenses, measuring reactions, looking for cracks. And what he found wasn't fear. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't a government scrambling to de-escalate before the new cycle moved on. What he found was resistance, organized, symbolic, and devastating. Less than 6 hours after Trump's speech, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum appeared in a national address, and she didn't choose a random government building. She didn't speak from a sterile press room. She spoke from Chapultepec Castle. If you don't know the significance of that location, you need to, because Sheinbaum knew exactly what she was doing. Chapultepec Castle is where, in September 1847, a group of young Mexican military cadets made the last stand against invading U.S. forces. Outnumbered and outgunned, they refused to surrender. According to Mexican history, 6 of them, some barely teenagers, died defending the castle. One reportedly wrapped himself in the Mexican flag and leapt to his death rather than let it be captured. They are known as Los Niños Héroes, the boy heroes. And in Mexico, they are not just historical figures. They are symbols of resistance, of sacrifice, of a nation that remembers what it cost to survive. By choosing that location, Sheinbaum wasn't just giving a speech. She was invoking ghosts. She was telling Trump and the world that Mexico remembers, that the wound of 1848 never fully healed, and that anyone who tries to reopen it will face not just a government, but a collective memory forged in blood. Her speech was short, calm, measured, and absolutely devastating. She addressed not just Mexico, but the entire world. She said Trump's words were an offense not only to Mexican history, but to the sovereignty of all free nations. She called them reckless, dangerous, beneath the dignity of any leader who claims to represent a democracy. Then came the line that instantly went global. She stated clearly that not 1 inch of Mexican territory, not 1 drop of its water, not 1 gram of its resources would ever again be subject to foreign plunder. She declared the doctrine of manifest destiny dead, buried, finished, and she warned that anyone who tried to resurrect it would face not a government, but an entire people. This wasn't anger dressed up as diplomacy. This was doctrine, a line in the sand drawn not with emotion, but with history. And then Mexico moved from words to action. The first move was immediate and practical. Sheinbaum announced the suspension of all cooperation with the United States on migrant containment. For years, Mexico has served as a buffer zone, intercepting migrants heading north before they reach U.S. territory. This arrangement benefited Washington enormously. It outsourced enforcement. It kept the pressure away from American borders. It made Mexico do the difficult, often thankless work. That cooperation is now frozen. The practical effect is obvious. Border pressure on Texas and Arizona will rise quickly. The very states Trump claims to be protecting will feel the consequences first, and Trump will face a domestic crisis he cannot ignore, created entirely by his own words. The second move was diplomatic. Mexico elevated the issue to the international level, initiating urgent diplomatic action to frame Trump's rhetoric as a threat to global stability. Formal communications were sent. Allies were briefed. The message was clear. This is not a bilateral dispute. This is about whether any nation can threaten territorial revision without consequences. That move strips Trump of narrative control. He wanted to look strong. Now he looks destabilizing. He wanted to project dominance. Now he's being framed as a danger, not by enemies, by the international community that once considered the United States its anchor. The third move was the most strategic of all, and it's the one that will matter most in the long run. Sheinbaum announced an accelerated diplomatic and economic pivot, immediate outreach to major global powers, new trade negotiations, new investment frameworks. One clear goal: reduce Mexico's dependence on the U.S. market as fast as possible. This is the part most people will miss. This isn't anti-American, it's anti-dependence. Because real power doesn't come from shouting louder than everyone else. It doesn't come from threats. It doesn't come from invoking past conquests. Real power comes from having alternatives. And once a country proves it has alternatives, the leverage flips quietly, irreversibly. Trump believed historical intimidation would force compliance. He thought Mexico would scramble to a peace. He thought the memory of 1848 would remind Mexico of its place. Instead, it unified Mexico internally. It elevated Mexico globally. What was meant to humiliate became a rallying point. What was meant to threaten became a catalyst. What was meant to divide became the very thing that brought a nation together. The ripple effects are already spreading far beyond the Rio Grande. Markets hate uncertainty, and nothing creates uncertainty faster than a leader questioning borders. Since Trump's speech, investors have been reassessing risk across North America. Stock futures wobbled. Currency markets shifted. Multinational corporations with operations in both countries are holding emergency calls. Regional trade frameworks are under strain. Latin American governments are closing ranks. Snorts. Leaders who might have stayed silent are now issuing statements of solidarity with Mexico. Not because they love Mexico, because they understand the president. If territorial revisionism is tolerated once, it can be invoked anywhere. And every nation in the region has borders that were drawn through conflict, negotiation, and yes, sometimes conquest. European officials are openly alarmed. Statements from Brussels, Berlin, and Paris have used words like concerning, destabilizing, and unprecedented. The transatlantic alliance, already strained by years of Trump's rhetoric, is creaking under this new weight, and China is watching closely, not with emotion, with strategy. Beijing sees an opportunity not to conquer, but to fill a vacuum. If the United States pushes Mexico away, China will happily step into that space. Trade deals, investment, infrastructure. The same playbook China has used across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. This crisis is no longer about Mexico alone. It's about whether territorial revisionism is allowed to re-enter international politics without consequences. It's about whether the post-World War II consensus, the one that said borders are settled, conquest is illegitimate, and power has limits, still means anything at all. For the United States, the path forward is narrowing by the hour. Escalation brings economic and diplomatic blowback that will hurt American workers, American companies, and American alliances. Retreat looks like weakness, especially to a base that just cheered the rhetoric. Trump is now being pressured to walk back, and Trump now faces pressure not just from abroad, but from inside. Border states that depend on Mexican trade, corporations whose supply chains run through Mexican factories, allies who have spent decades trusting American leadership and are now wondering if that trust was misplaced. For Mexico, the road ahead is risky but historic. If this moment translates into real diversification, real investment, real partnerships, it could mark the beginning of something profound. A second independence, not political this time, economic. A Mexico that trades with the world, not just its northern neighbor. A Mexico that sets its own terms because it has options. And that's why this moment matters far more than any single speech or summit. Trump didn't just revive the memory of 1848, he reminded the world why that era was supposed to be over, why the rules were written, why borders were fixed, why even the most powerful nations agreed to stop talking like conquerors. And Mexico's response showed what happens when a nation refuses to negotiate under threat. When it meets intimidation not with fear, but with clarity. When it uses the very history meant to shame it as a source of strength. This is no longer about trade deals. It's about sovereignty, about limits, about whether intimidation still works in a world that has already learned through blood and fire what unchecked power leads to. The world is watching now. Not just Mexico, not just the United States. Everyone. Because the president said here will echo far beyond this continent. If Trump's rhetoric goes unanswered, it opens doors that were supposed to stay closed forever. If it triggers real consequences, it proves that the rules still hold, that power still has limits, that borders still mean something. History isn't repeating itself yet, but it's standing at the door, listening, waiting, and what happens in the next days and weeks may redefine power in North America for a generation. Some moments change the weather. This one might change the climate. Stay close. This story is just beginning, and the ending hasn't been written.